Loneliness is a pandemic, and it's killing more people than anything that we've ever seen. By now, most people have seen the headlines from the CDC report that actually came out a couple of years ago, but has been repopularized about social isolation and loneliness. 25% of people over 65 are considered to be socially isolated, and over a third of people over 45 have reported extreme loneliness. The CDC put the overall risk of premature death for people who are socially isolated right up on par with smoking and obesity. The risk of dementia, 50% higher. Heart disease, 29%. Stroke, 32% greater risk. Socially isolated patients with heart disease are at 400% increased risk of death. And that's not even getting into depression, anxiety, and suicide risks that are obvious from that. But how are we addressing loneliness in the care of vulnerable populations like seniors and people with IDD? The two main approaches seem to be cramming people into senior communities like it's some sort of age based apartheid. Or there's also the very popular and nice sounding age in place. Now, that works on the assumption that just because someone doesn't want to live in a nursing home, they're somehow going to be happier and less isolated living on their own. Statistically speaking, they are alone with no transport, far from family that might visit, no friends nearby, retired, nowhere to go, nothing to do. Aging in place doesn't sound great if it's not a great place. There are many approaches that have had some success. Eden and Greenhouse homes, they identified loneliness as the main issue back in 1994. Host home shared living programs have been wonderful for people with IDD. But the solutions to loneliness in vulnerable populations have to be as diverse as the people that they're supporting. Not everyone wants the same thing in the same way. But the underlying need that all of those solutions have to address is about removing structural barriers to and facilitating connections. There have been attempts to legislate this sort of outcome, and they're as mixed and disappointing as I'm sure you would expect. The US Supreme Court in 1999 in the Olmsted decision stated that unjustified segregation of people with disabilities is in itself a form of discrimination. There's not a similar ruling for the elderly yet. Subsequent attempts to actually define what the Olmsted ruling means in practice have often had the opposite of the intended effect. In Minnesota last year, my company tried to change licensure on two buildings. They had been an intermediate care facility for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We're trying to create private rooms and still have a way for these 16 men, some of whom had lived there for 50 years with the same people. They wanted to stay together, and we wanted to help facilitate that. That's what they wanted. But the state rules on patient choice meant that they couldn't be covered under home and community-based services because the two buildings were too close together physically. They could fulfill the patient choice regulation only by living in a way that was the opposite of what they actually chose and having them move out to other places. As a nursing home administrator in training, at least once a week, I'd have to go and fish our resident escape artist, Ted, who's 93. We'd have to fish him out the strip club across the street. We'd reset his chair alarms, his door alarms, all the security monitoring. That man was practically a prisoner for his own safety. Ted didn't want to play bingo. Ted did not want to read Bible verses. Ted had no interest in arts and crafts club. Ted wanted to go and visit the ladies of negotiable virtue across the street. But the CMS regulations on protecting patient rights, they didn't cover Ted's rights to do that. I'd never even have got my license if we hadn't worked to contain poor Ted. When Dr. Susan Singer, first coined the phrase neurodivergent, she made the case that just as a healthy, thriving ecosystem requires biodiversity, a healthy, thriving culture requires neurodiversity. It's such an obvious and simple concept. We all benefit when we include people of all ages and all abilities and all ways of looking at the world. There's a huge body of research on the benefits of diversity. education, critical thinking, tolerance, reasoning skills, compromise skills, they all increase. And all of this leads us back to something that our great, great, great grandparents knew intuitively. A good community looks after each other, and everyone benefits because of that. I'm often asked, usually with incredulity or disdain, why on earth I learned to play the accordion. Uh, Now, I try and sound as cool as is possible for an accordionist. And I'll say, oh, yeah, I saw James Fearnley's amazing percussive style when he played for the Pogues, or Phil Cunningham with Silly Wizard, or Yuri Lomeshev from Gogol Bordello. But none of that's true. My granddad was fading away. He was lonely, he was bored, he was ready to die. And my dad got the idea that we should have him teach me the accordion. Jim, or Hamish in Scottish, he'd been a professional player at one point in his life. And there wasn't much else that I had in common with him when I was age 10. This was a guy who rode a motorbike, smoked a pack a day, and worked in the coal mine, all by age 11. He was the RAF boxing champion, a mechanic on Merlin engines and Spitfires in World War II. This was a tough old guy. So he taught me accordion. He was a terrible teacher. He'd just say, just do this. And you'd see his massive sausage fingers blurring with speed under his enormous, massive fists. Uh, he was just a terrible teacher. But he started playing again. He started talking to people again. He started going out to the RAF club, a veterans club, and playing music and having a drink or five. He found connection and meaning. I found out a lot about who my granddad was and the things that he'd learned in his life, and I gained a love of music. That's community. That's connection. It's really that simple. Whether you're writing legislation, caring for seniors or people with IDD, or you're just a human being who knows other human beings with challenges, start with the person. What do they want? What do they love? Where do they find meaning? How can we help them connect with others? It might be a church or a strip club. It might be heavenly harps or accordions from the bad place. Uh, what kind of communities could we have if everybody found one thing that they could connect with everyone else over? If we could all find one thing with everyone we meet that binds us together, or even that we can just learn from them or appreciate about them. Loneliness and all of its negative impacts doesn't have to be. If we can connect with one another, we can end loneliness for people who are isolated, and we can have better communities for all of us.